The deafening rhythmic roar of the factory suddenly died. The automated assembly line ground to a catastrophic halt. Flashing red warning lights bathed the massive steel floor in absolute panic. Andrea Moore, the CEO, stormed onto the floor, vibrating with furious stress. Nearby, a single dad in a faded gray uniform quietly pushed a mop. She glared at him, a cruel, dismissive smirk twisting her lips. "Repair it, janitor, and we'll talk." The junior engineers chuckled nervously. He put his mop down. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. 20 minutes later, the multi-million-dollar line roared back to life. His name was Lewis Carter, 47 years old with deeply calloused hands that could identify the specific threading of a bolt just by touch, and a quiet, unassuming posture that allowed him to blend entirely into the background of any room. He was a single father. His entire universe, the absolute, undeniable center of his existence, was his 11-year-old daughter, Emma. Emma was a brilliant, endlessly curious child who loved science. While other kids her age were watching cartoons, Emma was sitting at their small kitchen table, carefully disassembling broken toasters and remote-controlled cars just to see how the copper wires connected to the tiny electric motors. She was currently trying to build a miniature wind turbine out of cardboard and salvaged magnets. Luis saved every spare penny he could scrape together to buy her beginner engineering kits and science books. He wanted her to understand how the world was built, hoping she would one day design the future instead of just sweeping it up like he did. But building that world for her required a massive, humbling sacrifice. Luis wasn't always the man holding the mop. For over 15 grueling, highly successful years, he had been a master mechanical technician at a massive heavy-duty automotive stamping plant. He knew the complex, visceral language of heavy machinery. He knew how gears meshed, how bearings groaned under stress, and how hydraulic fluids smelled when a line was about to rupture. The old plant was a chaotic symphony of grease, fire, and raw power. But when the old manufacturing plant abruptly declared bankruptcy and shuttered its doors forever, Luis's specialized old-school mechanical skills suddenly felt obsolete in a rapidly digitizing world. He spent months applying for jobs, constantly rejected by young HR managers who wanted software degrees instead of grease-stained experience. With his savings dangerously low and Emma needing a stable home, Luis swallowed his immense pride. He took a job as a night shift sanitation worker, a janitor, at a pristine, ultra-modern tech manufacturing facility. It paid the rent. It provided health insurance. He never hid his past, but he never broadcasted it either. He just put his head down, mopped the floors, and made sure Emma had food on the table. The facility he now cleaned was a masterpiece of modern engineering. It produced highly specialized, microscopic titanium components for the aerospace industry. The heart of the factory was a massive, fully automated assembly line consisting of high-speed conveyor belts and 6-axis robotic picking arms. It was a sterile, beautiful, terrifyingly fast machine that felt more like a hospital operating room than a traditional factory. The woman who commanded this empire was Andrea Moore. 39 years old, holding dual degrees in business and computer science, she was a CEO who worshipped at the altar of automation, algorithms, and digital efficiency. To Andrea, the physical machines were simply dumb hardware. The true magic and the true value resided entirely in the millions of lines of proprietary software code that directed them. She placed her absolute, unquestioning faith in her elite team of young, tablet-wielding software engineers. On this specific, incredibly tense Tuesday afternoon, the factory was operating at maximum red-line capacity to fulfill a massive, high-stakes military contract. Luis was quietly pushing his yellow cleaning cart near Sector 4, carefully sweeping up metal shavings. Suddenly, a violent metallic shudder rippled through the concrete floor. The massive robotic arms froze midair. The high-speed conveyor belt slammed to a brutal, immediate halt. The ambient, productive hum of the factory was instantly replaced by the terrifying, high-pitched screech of digital master alarms. Across every single overhead monitor, a glaring red error message flashed. Critical fault, motor overload, Sector 4, drive away, chumnoy. The young software engineers scrambled from their glass-walled control room, sprinting onto the factory floor with their glowing laptops. The chaos had begun. The atmosphere on the factory floor instantly turned completely toxic. Andrea Moore marched out of the executive suite, her heels clicking aggressively against the polished concrete. She looked at the flashing red lights, her face pale with rising panic. Every single second that ticked by was $1,000 burn. The military contract had a strict zero-tolerance delay clause. If the transport trucks didn't leave the loading dock by 11:59 p.m., the entire quarter's profit would be completely wiped out in savage financial penalties. "What is happening?" Andrea demanded, her voice echoing sharply across the silent machinery. "Why is the line dead?" The lead systems engineer, a 26-year-old prodigy named Kevin, was frantically typing on his diagnostic tablet, his eyes wide with pure stress. Kevin's hands were physically shaking over his keyboard. He was an absolute genius with Python and C++, but he had never held a wrench in his entire life. He looked at the machine not as a heavy physical object, but merely as a stubborn puzzle of logic gates and digital pathways. "It's a digital fault, Ms. Moore," Kevin shouted, wiping sweat from his forehead. "The primary drive motor in Sector 4 is throwing an extreme thermal overload code. The programmable logic controller, PLC, automatically triggered the emergency safety kill switch to prevent the motor from catching fire." "Then bypass the code," Andrea snapped, crossing her arms. "Reboot the controller, flash the firmware, do whatever digital voodoo you have to do to get those robots moving again." "We're trying," Kevin yelled back, his fingers flying across the keys. "I'm running a deep-level software diagnostic. I'm resetting the sensor thresholds. We are rebooting the entire mainframe architecture." For 30 agonizing minutes, the elite team of engineers did absolutely everything they had learned in their expensive universities. They updated the firmware. They cleared the digital cache. They recalibrated the optical sensors. They stared at cascading walls of green code on their screens, desperately looking for a misplaced decimal point or a corrupted digital packet. Every time they hit the green restart button, the massive motor would hum for exactly 2 seconds before violently shutting down again. The red alarm continued to flash. The software was completely helpless. Loic was standing 20 feet away, leaning quietly against the handle of his mop. He wasn't looking at the glowing laptop screens. He was looking directly at the heavy steel housing of the Sector 4 conveyor drive shaft. He didn't need a computer to tell him what was wrong. He had heard it. Right before the massive machine had died, hidden beneath the ambient noise of the factory, Luis's highly trained ears had caught a very specific, terrifying sound. It wasn't a digital beep. It was the deep, rhythmic, agonizing groan of heavy steel violently grinding against heavy steel. It was the distinct sound of physical, mechanical agony. Luis watched the young engineers frantically typing. He realized with a heavy sigh that they were completely looking in the wrong direction. They were trying to cure a broken bone with a software update. He slowly walked forward, leaving his mop behind. "Excuse me," Luis said. His voice was deep, calm, and incredibly steady, cutting through the panicked shouting of the engineering team. Kevin, the lead engineer, looked up from his screen, incredibly annoyed. "What? Can't you see we are in the middle of a massive crisis? Go empty the trash somewhere else." Luis didn't flinch. He pointed a calloused finger toward the heavy steel casing protecting the primary drive shaft. "You keep resetting the software, but your software isn't broken," Luis said quietly. Right before the line tripped, there was a heavy, rhythmic, metallic friction sound coming from the primary carriage. "You need to check the physical alignment of the conveyor shaft." Kevin let out a sharp, arrogant, entirely dismissive laugh. "The physical alignment? Are you kidding me? The computer specifically says it's a thermal electrical overload. We have millions of dollars of diagnostic software monitoring this line. We don't need a janitor telling us how to do complex robotics." Andrea Moore stepped forward, her patience completely exhausted. She looked at Luis's gray, stained uniform. She saw the mop bucket behind him. In her highly stressed, deeply arrogant mind, he was nothing more than an uneducated laborer disrupting her brilliant engineers. She let out a cold, cynical sneer. "You think you know more than a team of MIT graduates because you sweep the floors?" Andrea mocked, her voice dripping with pure condescension, loud enough for the entire floor to hear. She pointed dramatically at the massive dead machine. "All right then, Repair it, janitor, and we'll talk. It wasn't a genuine offer. It was a vicious, sarcastic insult designed entirely to humiliate him and force him back into his place. A few of the junior engineers actually laughed, shaking their heads at the absurdity of the situation. Luis didn't flush red with anger. He didn't shout. He didn't defend his honor. He simply looked Andrea dead in the eye, his expression completely blank, utterly devoid of intimidation. I'll need a 3/4-inch socket wrench, a heavy-duty pry bar, and a dial indicator, Luis said calmly. And I need you to completely physically lock out the main power breaker. Now, if you firmly believe that the most massive, catastrophic problems are often hidden in the tiny, microscopic physical details that arrogant people completely ignore, hit that subscribe button to witness the exact moment the factory floor goes silent. The entire factory floor went completely, utterly silent. The mocking laughter instantly died in the throats of the junior engineers. Andrea Moore blinked, completely taken aback by his absolute, unwavering confidence. She had expected him to apologize and scurry away. Instead, he was aggressively demanding heavy tools. You can't touch that machine, Kevin stammered, stepping in front of the control panel. It voids the manufacturer's warranty. Your warranty doesn't matter if you miss the midnight military shipment and the company goes bankrupt, Kevin, Louis stated coldly, stepping past the young engineer. He looked directly at Andrea. You gave me an order, Ms. Moore. Do you want the line running, or do you want to keep staring at a red screen? Andrea stared at him. The sheer, overwhelming pressure of the ticking clock was crushing her. She looked at the dead robots. She looked at her incredibly expensive engineers who had completely failed her for the last 30 minutes. Lock out the power breaker, Andrea commanded softly, her voice trembling slightly. Get him the tools. Kevin looked horrified, but he didn't dare disobey the CEO. He ran to the main electrical panel and pulled the heavy red lever, physically cutting all voltage to Sector 4. A maintenance worker sprinted over with a heavy red metal toolbox and dropped it at Luis's feet. Luis didn't hesitate. He didn't look at the glowing laptops. He completely ignored the digital world. He dropped to his knees on the hard concrete. He grabbed the heavy 3/4-inch socket wrench and expertly attached it to the massive, thick steel bolts holding the protective safety guard over the primary conveyor drive shaft. With a few sharp, powerful, heavily practiced jerks of his arms, Luis broke the torque on the bolts. He removed the heavy steel plate and carefully set it aside. The inner workings of the massive machine were exposed. Thick, heavy steel gears, massive rubber drive belts, and a thick titanium drive shaft that transferred power to the entire robotic line. Bring a flashlight here, Luis ordered. Kevin, looking completely bewildered, stepped forward and shined his phone flashlight into the dark mechanical cavity. Luis didn't look at the wires. He didn't look at the circuit boards. He leaned in incredibly close to the heavy steel mounting bracket that held the primary bearing of the main drive shaft. He reached out with his bare, calloused hand and ran his fingertips along the edge of the heavy steel. He pulled his hand back. His fingertips were covered in a fine, glittering, incredibly dangerous substance. Fresh, silver metal shavings. Look right here, Luis said, his voice echoing in the quiet factory. He pointed the tip of his wrench directly at a massive, industrial carriage bolt securing the bearing block to the frame. The bolt was backed out. Not entirely. Just a fraction of an inch. Barely visible to the naked eye unless you knew exactly what to look for. What is that? Andrea asked, stepping closer, abandoning her personal space perimeter. This factory runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, Luis explained, his voice slipping into the authoritative tone of a master mechanic teaching an apprentice. That constant, relentless, heavy operation creates micro-vibrations. Over the last 6 months, those vibrations slowly backed this single retaining bolt out by exactly 3 millimeters. He pointed to the heavy titanium shaft. Because that bolt loosened, the entire bearing block shifted slightly downwards. That means this massive, heavy drive shaft is no longer spinning in a perfectly concentric circle. It's spinning eccentrically. It's wobbling. That wobble caused the steel shaft to aggressively, violently grind against the housing bracket. Louis looked up at Kevin, the software engineer. The extreme physical friction from that grinding metal required the electric motor to pull twice as much electrical amperage just to keep the belt moving. Your software isn't broken, Kevin. Your software did exactly what it was programmed to do. It detected the massive amp spike, assumed the motor was melting, and threw a thermal overload code to save the factory from burning down. It's not a software glitch, it's a loose bolt. The engineers stared at the metal shavings. They stared at the slightly crooked bolt. The absolute, undeniable physical reality of the problem completely shattered their arrogant digital illusions. "Can you fix it?" Andrea whispered, the mocking tone entirely gone from her voice. "I can't just tighten it," Louis said, wiping his hands on a rag. "The shaft is bound up by the friction. We have to completely relieve the tension on the main drive belt, manually pry the heavy bearing block back into perfect, microscopic alignment, retorque the retaining bolts to exactly 150 foot-pounds, and then reset the belt tension. I need 3 men to help me lift the tensioner arm." Nobody argued. Nobody asked for a digital simulation. For the next 45 minutes, the CEO of the company watched in absolute silence as the invisible janitor completely commanded her elite engineering team. The steel was completely unforgiving. It required brute, coordinated physical force. "Push!" Louis grunted, his own muscles bulging against the faded fabric of his uniform, sweat pouring down his forehead. The young engineers, accustomed to comfortable ergonomic mesh chairs and lightweight keyboards, strained and slipped, their clean hands struggling to grip the greasy pry bars. But under Luis's relentless, barking cadence, they moved as a single unit, manually muscling the heavy, stubborn steel machinery back into perfect alignment. Luis used a delicate dial indicator, a purely mechanical measuring tool, to verify the shaft was perfectly straight down to the thousandth of an inch. He grabbed his torque wrench and locked the massive bolts down with a heavy, satisfying click. Luis stood up. He was covered in dark grease and sweat. He looked at Kevin. "Re-engage the primary power breaker, clear the thermal code, start the line." Kevin ran to the panel. He threw the heavy red lever back into the on position. He typed frantically on his laptop, clearing the emergency fault cache. He hit the green restart button. The entire factory held its collective breath. The massive electric motor whined to life. The heavy rubber belts engaged. The titanium shaft began to spin. There was no grinding. There was no horrific metallic screech. There was only the beautiful, smooth, rhythmic, flawless hum of perfectly aligned, perfectly balanced heavy machinery. The 6-axis robotic arms swung back into motion, executing their welds with terrifying precision. The flashing red lights turned a solid, brilliant, beautiful green. The line was running flawlessly. Louis didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply bent down, picked up his heavy yellow mop bucket, and quietly began walking back toward Sector 5 to finish his sanitation shift. An hour later, the midnight military shipment was successfully loaded onto the transport trucks with exactly 5 minutes to spare. The catastrophic financial disaster had been entirely averted. Andrea Moore stood in the center of the massive, glass-walled executive boardroom overlooking the busy factory floor. The entire elite engineering team was seated around the mahogany table. The atmosphere was incredibly subdued, completely stripped of its usual tech bro arrogance. "I want a full, unvarnished debrief," Andrea demanded, crossing her arms, her eyes scanning the exhausted faces of her top-tier engineers. How did an entire team of highly educated systems architects spend an hour trying to fix a software code while a man pushing a mop diagnosed a catastrophic mechanical failure in 3 seconds? Kevin, the lead engineer, looked down at his expensive laptop. He swallowed hard, his pride completely dismantled. "He was right, Ms. Moore," Kevin admitted quietly, his voice lacking all its previous bravado. "We pulled the historical maintenance logs. The digital sensors only monitor internal motor temperature and RPMs. Our entire predictive maintenance checklist relies strictly on software diagnostics. We don't have a single protocol for manually checking the physical torque of the mounting bolts on the primary drive carriage. We assume that if the computer said the machine was healthy, the machine was healthy." Andrea looked out through the glass down to the factory floor. She saw Lewis Carter far in the distance, quietly emptying a recycling bin. She had spent millions of dollars recruiting minds that could build incredible virtual worlds, but she had completely, tragically neglected the hands needed to sustain the physical one. She had looked at a man's dirty boots and instantly assumed his mind was empty. "Call him up here," Andrea ordered. 5 minutes later, the heavy glass doors opened. Luis walked into the pristine, heavily air-conditioned boardroom. He was still wearing his faded gray uniform. His hands were thoroughly scrubbed, but the heavy grease was permanently embedded in the deep lines of his knuckles. He didn't look intimidated by the wealth or the glass walls. He stood calmly, waiting. "Mr. Carter," Andrea said, her voice respectful, careful. "My team just confirmed your analysis. The mechanical alignment was the root cause. We narrowly avoided a devastating failure." She paused, stepping closer to him. "I pulled your HR file while you were working," Andrea continued, her eyes searching his face. "You didn't list any technical qualifications on your application. You applied strictly for overnight sanitation. Why? How did you know exactly what that sound meant?" Lewis looked at the incredibly expensive, highly advanced executives sitting around the table. He offered a small, deeply humble smile. "I spent 15 years as a master technician in a heavy automotive stamping plant. Ms. Moore," Lewis explained quietly. "Long before everything was connected to a Wi-Fi network or a glowing tablet. We didn't have thermal sensors. We had to use our eyes, our hands, and our ears." He looked directly at Kevin. "You have built a beautiful, incredibly smart digital brain for this factory," Luis said, his voice carrying the immense weight of hard-earned wisdom. "But you forgot that the brain is attached to a heavy, violent physical skeleton. Steel bends, bolts loosen, friction destroys. You can't code away gravity. Machines will always speak to you. They will always tell you exactly what is hurting them, long before the computer ever throws an error code. You just have to be willing to actually listen to them." The boardroom was dead silent. The young, brilliant engineers looked at the man in the gray uniform with a profound, completely undeniable sense of awe. They hadn't lost an argument. They had been exposed to a massive, glaring gap in their own pristine education. Andrea Moore stood perfectly still. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. She had built a corporate culture that aggressively worshipped expensive degrees and flashy digital software, while actively disregarding and openly mocking the gritty, physical, hands-on experience required to keep the real world functioning. She looked at Luis. She remembered the cruel, horrific words she had spoken to him on the floor. "Repair it, janitor, and we'll talk." She had evaluated his entire human worth based exclusively on the color of his uniform. "Mr. Carter," Andrea said, her voice dropping, completely abandoning her arrogant CEO persona. "I owe you a profound, sincere apology. My behavior on the floor was entirely unacceptable. I let my stress dictate my humanity, and I judged you in a way that I deeply regret." Luis nodded slowly. He didn't demand she grovel. He accepted the apology with quiet dignity. "Apology accepted, ma'am. Stress makes us all say things we don't mean." Andrea walked back to her desk and picked up a tablet. "Earlier today, I told you that if you repaired the line, we would talk," Andrea said, a genuine, completely respectful smile finally reaching her eyes. "I intend to heavily honor that statement." She walked back over and handed him the tablet. "I am immediately dissolving your sanitation contract. I am officially offering you a position as the Senior Mechanical Operations Advisor for this entire facility. You will not manage people from a desk. You will walk the floor. You will audit the physical machinery. You will teach my elite software team how to actually listen to the steel. And you will have the absolute authority to halt production if you hear something you don't like." Luis looked at the staggering salary figure glowing on the screen. It was life-changing. It was more money than he had ever made in his entire life. It meant Emma could go to any engineering camp she wanted. It meant they could finally buy a house. But Luis didn't immediately say yes. He looked up at the CEO. "Miss Moore, I am incredibly grateful," Luis said quietly. "But my daughter Emma gets off the school bus at 3:30 p.m. Since her mother passed away, I am the only one there to help her with her science projects. I took the night shift as a janitor specifically so I could be awake for her in the afternoons. I cannot work a standard corporate executive schedule. She needs her father. Andrea didn't hesitate for a single microsecond. You dictate your own schedule, Luis, she said firmly. You come in when you want. You leave at 3 p.m. every day to get Emma. I don't pay you to sit in a chair. I am paying you to be the only person in this massive building who actually understands how the world works. Luis smiled. He reached out and shook her hand. Over the next few months, the entire culture of the factory completely transformed. The massive robotic line ran with unprecedented, flawless stability. The maintenance protocols were entirely rewritten. Before any engineer was allowed to run a software diagnostic, they were legally required by the new manuals to perform a physical, tactile inspection of the hardware. They called it the Carter Protocol. Luis no longer wore a gray uniform. He wore a clean polo shirt and carried a clipboard. But more importantly, as he walked the massive, noisy factory floors, nobody ever looked past him again. Nobody ever looked at his boots and made an assumption about his intellect. Because the entire company had learned a brutal, invaluable, and permanent lesson. True genius doesn't always carry a glowing tablet or a fancy degree. Sometimes the most brilliant, essential mind in the entire room is simply the one who knows exactly how to pick up a wrench and listen when the world starts breaking. If you firmly believe that true skill and deep experience are completely independent of a person's job title or uniform, hit that subscribe button to follow more powerful stories of the quiet truth winning in the end. Tell us in the comments down below, have you ever been severely underestimated or judged as less than simply because of the job you were doing, only to step up and prove everyone completely wrong?